and welcome to Living One. I'm your host, Olivia Crossman. Living One is Kerulos' monthly webinar series, now in its 5th year. With guest speakers from around the world, we listen in to how people are bridging their ethics, minds, and lives into alignment with nature for earth and animal liberation and revitalization. We ask the question, we know what's wrong, but what does right look like? This year, in collaboration with the Plant Initiative, we start off with a special series, Plant Voices, Guides to Understanding Nonviolent Living. Today and through the month of May, we hear 5 speakers reflect on what plants can teach us about nonviolent living, how plant sentience affects and informs plant-based living, and ways to model and maintain nature nonviolence as plant-based consumers. Today, we have the first session in this series. Our first guest is Ed Casey. In addition to his numerous books, Professor Casey is a distinguished professor and former department chair of philosophy at Stony Brook University and was the president of the American Philosophical Association. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are all currently on various different Indigenous lands. I'm currently on the ancestral homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, which includes the Ojibwa, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. This land exists also as a place of trade with other Indigenous communities, including the Ho-Chunk, Miami, Menominee, Sauk, and Meskwaki. The Kerulos Center for Nonviolence is located on the homelands of the grizzly bear, Takelma, Daku Bedite, coyote, coho salmon, golden eagle, and gray wolf. Ed will be speaking for about 45 minutes, after which we will have 15 minutes for question and answer. Please keep your microphone muted to avoid any unintended interruptions during Ed's presentation. If you have any questions for Ed, type them in the chat and we will read them out after the presentation. This Zoom session will be recorded, so if you would feel more comfortable leaving your camera off or changing your Zoom name, please feel free to do so. Finally, we ask that all of us participate with full respect and attention to each other in the spirit of peace and wisdom that Living One seeks to foster. So, without further ado, we welcome Ed Casey.
Thank you, Olivia. I'm delighted to open this series of talks on plant life. I do so not as a plant specialist, but as a philosopher of place who has recently turned his attention to the way that place figures in the life of plants. Together with my colleague Michael Marder, we have recently written and published a book titled The Place of Plants, a Phenomenology of the Vegetal. Michael is a former student of mine who has become well-known for remarkable work on plants. I've written several books on place as it figures into diverse contexts, though never before discussing the unique placiality of plants. 2 years ago, Michael and I wrote a collaborative article on trees and place, and we surprised ourselves by how much we had to say about this topic. Since trees are themselves plants, it was a natural step to take to write something more systematic about the placial dimension of plants overall. Hence our book on the topic, which appeared quite recently with Columbia University Press. In this book, on which I shall draw today, we look into many aspects of plant placiality. Our contention is not only that plants have distinctive places, more than I can cover indeed in this brief talk, but that these places are integral to their sheer vitality, a unique vitality among living things on this planet. Even if humans and other animals deeply appreciate the life of plants, it is striking that little has been said about the source of this vitality. It is our view that this vitality is very much based in how plants not merely occupy places of their own, but are their own places. But what kind of places are these? Today, I'll attempt to give a brief answer to this question, an answer that is essential to a responsible and sensitive environmentalism. And a brief word to begin with on my construal of place itself. Western thinkers of modernity, from Newton to Kant, have insisted on the primacy of space and time over place, which, even if important to ancient Western thinking in the guise of such terms as topos and locus, has been notably neglected in cosmological geological theory. My book, The Fate of Place, traces the history of this forgetting and repression of a concept that is nevertheless integral to life on Earth, whether that of animals or humans or plants. Considered as a mere subunit of space, or irrelevant to time, place as experience, placeality as I like to call it, is essential to the many various ways that anything with life exists on this planet. There is no placeless such life. But this is not to say that place means the same thing in each of its many avatars. Placeality is as various as the creatures who live in it and by it, including ourselves and other animal species. Especially critical, even if massively neglected, is the placeality of plants, which Michael Marder and I contend must now, at long last, gain more complete recognition and careful description. So what follows is an abbreviated sketch of some of the more detailed forays we undertake in our book, Plants in Place. So, to start with, I ask you, what would it be like to be stuck in one place indefinitely? You can be sure that this would be supremely frustrating, certainly so for human beings and for other animals whose lives are built on the real possibility of movement understood as displacement or relocation from one place to another. When that movement is denied, inherently mobile beings are undermined in their plans and projects. Their horizons narrow down very abruptly and drastically. If momentary only, this is bearable. But when it is a matter of being trapped in one location, it can be intolerable. Hence the extreme suffering of being held in solitary confinement in a prison, a situation that is known to lead to psychosis and suicide, and even short of these, to a form of misery any other. Only the most stalwart can survive in these circumstances. Nelson Mandela, for example, who not only managed to stay sane, but to do significant writing while in that altogether confined state. But this was quite exceptional. Far from flourishing, most humans regress and degenerate in such isolation, physically, psychically, socially. To be inherently stationary suits mainly one kind of life on Earth. That is the life of plants. With rare exceptions, their entire life is spent linked to one place. They not only survive there, they flourish in that place, and in many respects make it what it is. But we must ask, what does place mean here? Normally, we think of place as location, that is a point in space, or a stretch of it, where space is considered endless, infinite, in the word that Newton insisted on. It follows a place so conceived is something that is properly measured in so many units as determined by the needs of various human projects, and occupied, filled up with discrete bodies. But further reflection tells us that place as experienced, is something else beyond what Whitehead calls simple location. A preliminary assessment turns up the following 5 basic traits of plant life, all closely related with their stationary state of being. Burrowing action first. The roots of plants find their way through the soil, inching through the earth as in their proper element, searching for adequate nutrition. Though plants have no shovels, they do find their way in the soil as if tunneling through the earth and excavating it. In various scientific studies, plant roots have been found to navigate underground labyrinths, which they in part create by their burrowing actions, thereby creating narrow channels. So that's what I'm calling burrowing action. Secondly, downward movement. The tunneling is done in a largely, though not entirely, downward direction, down from the mid portion of the seed and from upper parts of plants that seek air and sun in the open air. The downward direction is an integral part of a definite trajectory, depending on the kind of plant and the geophysical region in which it is proceeding mainly underground, obeying the force of gravity translated into biochemical signals that tell plants where down is. They dig into a seemingly ever receptive earth. Thirdly, upward movement. Although it is tempting to think of plants as hugging the earth from which they spring, they're also notable for their growing up in a vertical direction, up into the air that surrounds them and that is enriched with the oxygen they exhale, as well as the moisture which they channel from underground sources and release through their leaves, as if they are reaching into a surrounding atmosphere, their upper ambience, as it were. Fourthly, outward unfolding. Plants grow aslant as well as and up. They branch out. They reach out to their lateral peripheries, seeming to grasp at what surrounds them. The factor of the periphery is a key here. Plants grow out around themselves by relying on their exquisitely refined sense of proprioception. Finally, intercalation with other life. Plants are inherently social beings, relating both to other plants and to other forms of life, including many beings who live largely underground, worms, various insects, and at a micro level, of course, fungi and bacteria. Indeed, entire communities are almost always at play in the life of plants. To be sessile is not necessarily to be solitary, but may implicate an entire world of beings gathering around an anchored existence, some of them animate, though many are not. It should also be mentioned with regard to intercalation that the unfolding, growing, and all other vegetal movements are oriented, directed toward, or at the very least, seek solar energy, moisture, and minerals, such that their symbiotic quest amounts to a co-orientation, co-directedness, or we could call it vegetal co-intentionality, creating unique forms of community. Now, what at first looks like sheer passivity on the part of plants is then, on closer inspection, something quite vibrant, a matter of process rather than of fixed substance. To be sessile is not to be fixed in place, but to be active in place and with place. Or better yet, as I like to put it, it is to enact place. It is not just to be active in place, but to activate place itself. To be situated in such a way as to be continually compared to the fixed form, continually perform a place, to perform a place, to bring its new forms into being, new compared to the fixed forms at stake when place is considered reducible to being a unit or part of a space, a passive segment of a volume that is regarded as itself metrically definite, up to the limit of infinite. So with plants, we're talking of something that is not only located in a place, but is itself place generative. While the beginning of growth often occurs by chance, there's nothing haphazard about the ongoing patterns of plants. Having received various types of information about the surroundings, a seedling places new leaves, shoots in the most adventitious spots. The investment of energy that goes into this endeavor is so high that it can be a matter of life and death. In environments with little resources, the plant's decision on the exact site of new growth, further extending roots and leaves, roots and shoots, the decision that arises at the intersection of over 15 environmental stimuli in plant signal processing does not leave much margin for error. Now, from a phenomenological point of view, which is the point of view that we take in this book, we might say that the deliberate placement of new organs allows the plant to forge, that is, to construct and construe the place of its growth, meaningful and hence livable from its unique standpoint and physical position. In short, plant life teaches us that places, dynamic interactions of co-emplacement and self-placement. Now, the insight emerging here is profound. The sessility of plants, rather than being a matter of a surely passive being, not only tolerates mutation, but itself consists in such mutation. And this mutation is not merely external, a matter of the exact shape of plants, which varies greatly from species to species, as well as within the plants of a given species, indeed from one plant to the next, but also of their ways of being on and in Earth, both by themselves and in relation to other plants, as well as to multiple forms of life, including but not restricted to human life. The place of plants may be stationary and preclude locomotion compared to that of inherently mobile animals, including that of humans. But there is no doubt, there can be no doubt, that it is a very active life that deserves its own description and discussion within the limits of what Marder and I designate as phytophenomenology. Note here that this merely preliminary discussion of plants I've just given so far has been saturated with humanoid claims and modes of description. Yet the larger task is to try to understand plants more in their terms than in ours alone. What would this shift in emphasis entail? Well, we can't give up recourse to human language and thus to our own characteristic forms of thinking. After all, you are now hearing me speak in words that present arguments and insights that are undeniably human in their formulation, even if they aim at describing decidedly non-human ways of life. But we can attempt to push the limits of language farther out than is usually attempted in most prose descriptions. Thereby, we might say, meeting the plants halfway. This I shall start to do by attending next to several paradoxes that are involved in the life of plants as we humans can attempt to understand it. Paradox number one. When plants are fully stationary, they are likely to be alive and well. When humans are immobile, they are sleeping, seriously ill, or dead. The medical phrase vegetative state expresses this paradox well. Second paradox, while plants are sessile without special effort, that is their mode of being in the world, humans often have to undertake strenuous efforts to become fully recumbent. Not only do they have to slow down, but to settle down. And this is something far from easy if they, when I'm now talking about human beings, are agitated, or if the world is very demanding or otherwise lacks quietude at the time. A third paradox, yet both of these very different ways of being in the world, take place in place. Place somehow subtends each situation, both inherent sessility and equally inherent mobility. How can this be? What is it, then, about place that underlies each of these opposed modes, their stark diversity, the modes of being of plants and of human beings? Answering this is essential to the basic project of the book, Plants in Place. Now, it's not sufficient to say, as I just did, I couldn't refuse it apparently, that place subtends or underlies plant stationariness and human mobility. More is involved, more is at stake than being merely underlying, which is a mere descriptor for the empirical fact that we humans tend to deem place, first level of consideration, as what is underfoot when we are standing or walking. But we need to question this assumption that place is, as it were, always right underfoot, right under us, under our lived bodies. For one thing, place is not always under bodies, animated or not. It is as much around sensitive beings as beneath them, where around may include a dimension of under, but much more as well, namely its being outspread. The way it extends outward and beyond the very locus of a given organism, as well as beneath it. And such aroundness may even include a factor of being over, as when a plane on which we are now situated arcs abruptly upward so as to become a mountain. As with, for example, the flatlands of western Kansas and eastern Colorado, as they turn abruptly into the Rocky Mountains that emerge dramatically from these lowlands. Here our look goes upward as we take in the mountains before us. With plants and places, both harking back to the Latin term planta, it is usually the other way around. Majestic as they may be, both are subjected, again, plants and places, both are subjected physically and metaphysically to the lowest position imaginable, literally underfoot, despite their being outspread and despite their possibility of being over us. But being under, around, or over offers only the first of three ways in which place is a for plants and human animals, namely by its, what I like to call its directionality. Equally important is the way in which place offers a meaningful scene of presentation for all that moves on it or grows in it. Place names this scene, scene being a word that in its original Greek form of skena signifies booth, tent, and more generally, stage. The place of plants, as well as of humans and much else, is a presentational scene where the phenomenal presence of something can appear, whether that thing be a mite, a mouse, or a mountain. Place, as I'm using the term, makes all this possible as a basis for what is presented there, sent forth for the apprehension of whoever or whatever is able to take it in. Place in this second acceptation is thus, let us call it, a scene of display. Things and events, people and plants and animals, hills and mountains show up and present themselves to be seen, grappled with, noted, manipulated, admired, or reviled, including from a plethora of perspectives of other than human beings. It is the basis, place is the basis of the there that comes forward from whatever here belongs to percipient beings of many kinds. Place is further dynamizing. It's not just a resting place, but a place where things happen, as in a scene or on a stage, sometimes routinely and sometimes in novel ways that cannot be anticipated, though eventually most of them can be understood scientifically or otherwise. Place is more than the mere locus or occasion of such happenings, even if it may be very tempting to reduce it to this for the sake of convenience. Instead, it often actively contributes to the happening of the event by providing the force and the inspiration for this event. As we say in English, taking place without either seizing or appropriating it in anything like an exclusive manner. For many things would not happen at all, but for the place they are in and from which they take their inspiration. For example, certain crops not thrive except in certain soils. This is not just a matter of an efficient causal nexus, but of the active possibilizing that certain soils and in viniculture, the ensemble of what is called terroir, enable and others do not. Further, place is sustaining. Again, like a stage, it provides support from below and all around, but it is also sustaining in the sense of nourishing, rather than merely propping up. In the case of plants, the two senses of sustaining, physically supporting, and nourishing are interlaced in the stabilizing and osmotically operative presence of the root system of a plant. The roots convey water and other nutrients to the upper parts of plants. Soil itself is sustaining. This helps to explain its importance in raising crops. A depleted, acidified, or salinized soil cannot sustain whatever may be planted on it. That is, anything. It cannot support just anything. Soil supports life, especially plant life, that must count on its combination of resiliency and firmness. Finally, place is consolidating. It brings together the four traits we have just singled out by generating ever new and unexpected combinations. Such consolidation helps to explain why finding the right home place is so highly valorized in virtually every human society. For it is in a home place that a dynamized scene of presentation occurs in a quite routine way, as this is made accessible in areas that provide space for mutual support. Plants have their own equivalents of such consolidation, though they are largely underground among the tangle of roots that, regarded as a single mass, is the equivalent of a home place that acts as a sustaining presence in and through the life of a given plant. In broader terms, the appropriateness of plants to particular climates, say tropical plants that cannot survive well in northern latitudes, exemplifies such home places as does the particular neighborhood where they thrive or not, depending on the other species of plants growing next to them, the availability of sunlight or sun exposure in the places of their growth, and comparable factors. Seen through this lens, recent climate change may be regarded as a planetary scale loss of home places, a displacement of the places themselves, including the plants growing there, and then of masses of other environmental refugees. Clearly, place on which I place so much emphasis in this talk is because it's my own ongoing obsession. I have to admit, place is multi-dimensional. This very feature helps to explain at once its pervasiveness. It is everywhere in plant and animal worlds. Their worlds, as I like to say, are place worlds, as well as it's important for any adequate assessment of life on Earth. Place is a dimension of dimensions, an element of elements. And yet, it has been systematically overlooked or, if recognized, misunderstood as a mere modality of space, subject to quantification and striation. Striation is Deleuze and Guattari's term for space that is quantifiable, as in modern mapping. To striated space, they oppose smooth space. That is none other than place, as we have been describing it. This is exemplified by this is Deleuze and Guattari in their major book, A Thousand Plateaus. This is exemplified by their understanding of nomad space, which is the trajectory of nomadic movement between various pre-established locations, the equivalent of a series of places between which a given nomadic group moves on a periodic basis, with variations induced by weather and certain practical considerations. Thus is established in a continually reanimated, what we could call a placial circuit. Such a circuit, even if non-permanent, sustains and consolidates a given nomadic group's collective life. Now, we know that the migration of certain animals, follows a pattern not unlike that of human nomads, bison, elk, and still other species. When such patterns are interrupted, as has happened at the U.S. Mexico border, La Frontera, it can be disastrous to the survival of the members of the species in question. Less familiar is the surprising fact that something very much like this holds true for certain plants. That's certain members of the species in question. Less familiar is, I here repeat myself, is the surprising fact that something very much like this holds true for certain plants that exhibit their own nomadism. In seeds, sprouts, and pollen, plants condense themselves, distilling their being into something portable. A tumbleweed diaspore deviates from this rule as virtually the entire plant, in this case, detaches from the root to roam the world, to roam the earth in the wind. By and large, the treble light, plants treble light, packing the bare minimum indispensable for future growth elsewhere. The growth destined to be shaped by and eventually to shape the seed's landing site, that as the seed germinates will metamorphose into the place of the mature plant. Now, how plants are dispersed is significant in its own right. Letting the diaspore and its contents drop down to earth or entrusting it to the wind, the pollen attaching to butterfly wings, or the seeds wending their way to another place in the stomachs of birds, all these acts are awash with the contingencies of carrying and landing. In throwing themselves and opening themselves up to dis or relocation, plants throw their fates to chance. As a compensation for the uncertainty of the outcome, they increase the number of throws, following a near infinity of possible trajectories, some of them bound to succeed even if a vast majority fails. This may be said to point toward a notion of what we can call the event of plants. Not just the fact, but the event of plants. Plants are happenings, both dovetailing with and diverging from the processes of human migration and diasporic dispersion. The placiality of plants is a virtual terra incognita, and I am here providing only a first brief but concerted consideration of what such placiality consists in. Increasingly more will be discovered on many fronts as the life of plants is further investigated by botanists and plant scientists. But place as such is unlikely to figure in these investigations, given that it resists strict scientific determination. And it does so because it is mainly whose proper understanding is phenomenological, not scientific. My own approach in this new book, The Place of Plants, is largely, sometimes loosely, as I've said, phenomenological. That means being true to and reflecting the actual experience, either of plants themselves or of ourselves in relation to plants. So Marder and I, my companion author, take up how we ourselves experience plants, as well as how plants themselves can be said to experience their worlds, whether these worlds are contiguous with our own human worlds or not, while indicating the points of contact or occasional intersections between these two forms of experience. Now I'm going to move to some final thoughts on this rather densely compacted paper, which attempts to put into this brief presentation what takes several hundred pages in the book itself. So with all the emphasis I have placed on place as the basis of a plant's docility, you might have begun to wonder, have I not undermined, literally undermined the vitality of plants, their efflorescence, there's upspringing and outspringing vitality. This is what Henri Bergson called their élan vital, their vital force. Is such force not just what inspires us today and provides the inspiration for the series of talks here sponsored by Kerulos? Whereas we're all too aware of the extinction of animal species across the globe and under the oceans, and while we cannot avoid having dark visions of the future of humankind in the wake of the Anthropocene, human beings have brought about themselves, many are turning to plants for inspiration, for a vital sense of new life, and a life that is continually adapting itself creatively to the dangers and limitations of animal and human life on Earth. But one might wonder, have not I and my co-author turned the other way by pointing to the placial basis of plant life, turned the other way away from this sheer vitality that Bergson insisted upon in his great book, Creative Evolution of 1907? I think not. Our position is just the opposite, that the inspiring vitalism of plant life requires the stable basis that this life calls for and flourishes precisely from this basis. And how can this be the case? The answer is, how can it not be? In closing my talk today, let me spell this out briefly. Think about the reverse case first. Were it not for their placial rootedness, the life of plants on Earth would be rendered vulnerable in the extreme. Made vulnerable and altogether ephemeral, rootless plants would literally fly away, much as do tumbleweeds do already. But these plants, tumbleweeds, are designed to do just this, to move from location to location as swept around diasporatically by desert winds. In any case, they are the exception among plants whose stabilization in place is their endemic trademark. This is why we refer to plants as sessile. I've done this several times already in this talk. That's a word that is defined in English as attached at the base. Put positively, the places of plants are integral to their very vitality, for it is from their base, in place, that the very élan vital stems literally construed as the main body of a plant, the supporting stalk. For the stalk proceeds from the base in the roots of a plant, and as a result, we can say that the vitality of a plant stems from their being in place. Of course, it also proceeds from the light and air that form the photosynthetic ambience of the upper parts of plants. But this is more evident and easier to single out. What has been buried from direct observation and lost sight of is the base of plants, their underground component that constitutes, on my way of reading it, the place per se of plants. Now, the buried part of a plant is often characterized as its roots, but I maintain that this subterranean base is best characterized as a unique form of placement on Earth, where this signifies a locatedness that is unique to each species of plant, a way of occupying space and time in place. Moreover, this occupation is active, not passive, not just because of the communicative network formed by fungi, lichen, and much more, between which there is continual interchange, but because taken as a vibrant totality, or rather, as a detotalized totality that is much more than the sum of its parts, it actively supplies a place to be for the plant as a whole, its own unique place, the place where it is. It is the place of a given plant, and that provides the living dynamic basis of a plant's energetic vitality. This is the vitality that the series of talks sponsored by the Kerulos Center for Nonviolence aims to celebrate. And I'm delighted and honored to have given the first talk in this series. So I thank you for listening to what may have seemed dense and place preoccupied, but this is characteristic of the way that I think when it comes to any topic, now including plants. Thank you for listening, and I welcome comments or questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Ed. That was excellent. Really fascinating. We do have a couple questions that came in the chat that I can read out to you. The first is from Ralph, who is wondering, what do you make of locomotive kinds of plants, e.g. a certain species of mangrove in Australia that lifts and replants roots in adjustment to changes in environmental conditions?
Yeah, I call this a process of re-emplacement, and some plants have a genius for not having themselves tied exclusively, uniquely, and forever to one place, but to change places. It doesn't really alter my thesis that nevertheless, each successive place is integral to the vitality and life of that plant. It just means that place here takes on a certain mobility that is quite remarkable and actually fits with my own interpretation of place as something that cannot be fixed in the way in which the measurement of space is fixed in terms of meters, miles, mappability, and so forth. But place is a dynamic dimension of our lives, animal lives, and plant lives. So it isn't actually stuck with being in one place forever. Probably, however, we could say that depending on the species, certain kinds of place will be characteristic and will be expectable. And that does include plants whose places can change periodically in keeping with climate change, weather, in other words, a rather remarkable adaptability of placement. That is surely part of the genius of plants. I think, we humans and many other animals are far less able to change place without disastrous consequences, starting with homesickness, going all the way to deep depression. We know the costs that we humans have when we attempt to change from a place we've known very well to a new place. It can be very, very more than taxing. It can be overwhelming. Thing about plants, as with many animals, but not all, is what we call the flexibility of emplacement, really allowing plants a remarkable viability in many, many climatic conditions and many soil conditions. It's really a form of earthbound genius that, ironically, is proceeding mostly invisibly to us humans. So that makes it all the more intriguing to think about it. I mean, the place that we move between, these places are measurable and predictable and actually describable in so many words for the most part. But here we have places of plants moving quietly, silently, invisibly, and yet powerfully to make their way of being on Earth unique and inspiring to us. It should be inspiring to us because of their way by which they not just adapt. This is not just a Darwinian matter of survival. It's something far more impressive. We try to show in a chapter in this new book that this is a current theme that's come out quite recently on the part of other authors, Peter Wohlleben, for example, in his book, The Hidden Life of Trees. We try to affirm this. The hidden life of trees has to do with the co-placement of trees who create among themselves a form of community, which includes a form of actual communication, just not in the usual semiotic forms that we humans are used to, but nevertheless is a very significant form of collaboration among trees. So this constitutes a special kind of place whose members are each actively engaged in the co-inhabitation and co-involvement that trees can realize in a copse or forest or any group. This then has important social and political consequences because we realize this is a form of community that we humans rarely achieve because of because of all the things ruin this for us: greed, capitalism, thirst for power, the will to power, as Nietzsche calls it, having the power to disrupt and undermine this form of spontaneous, vital community that trees exhibit so manifestly. But plants underground, they're equally communal. And this is really an extraordinary situation. There's a great book just appeared called Entangled Life that I much recommend, which actually makes the argument for this special underground communal life that plants do engage in, and not just engage in, but actively create, which is what's so impressive. You can see that here the whole approach is to question the passivity, the apparent passivity of plants, and to look for their special, unique forms of activism. And again, as I've been emphasizing, co-activism. That seems to me to be inspiring for us humans who are less successful in creating such communities among ourselves than our plants. No doubt that may mean the plants will survive us and as they preceded us. It's interesting to think that this has to do with a very exquisite, refined, powerful sense of place. And it's a very different approach, you see, to the appreciation of plant life that I hope that I'm bringing to the subject matter of plants, of the very experience of plants. Well, that's one response to a complicated question, right?
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Ralph, for your question. Our next question is from Isabella, who is wondering, well, it starts with a comment. I loved the section in the book about eventful edges. I'm very interested in liminal places, peripheries, and the book suggested the dynamism of edges, growth zones. Yesterday, I met an old apple tree whose trunk is completely hollow, yet she is a bloom at her edges. The bark exists, the roots seek. In a way, this is aligned with Ralph's question. I'm asking how much plants enact edges, thus moving, at least at times, away from the central place.
Yeah, that's the whole theme of the book that I didn't take up in my talk today. It comes from another book I wrote called The World on Edge, where I argue that edges are not just limits. They're not just where things stop, but they're very much places where things start, or at least can be creatively, dynamically, outward moving. And here I argued that plants have a genius for this. They're all edges, if you think about it. Edges in the soil, edges in the sky, edges on earth. So it's part of a general, much more general thesis I've been pursuing for many years, which is that the dynamics occurs at the peripheries, and less often in the center, as we would like to believe, particularly when we put ourselves at the center. This is way off base. And so the really interesting question is, what is happening at the very edges? Well, this was already, Darwin was already aware of this, that it sometimes takes extraordinary edge situations to bring out creative action that leads to survival and species alteration itself. And so I try to argue in that part of the book that plants have a kind of edge genius. They edge their way into the soil, they edge their way out of the soil, they edge their way into our lives, as at least we call them peripheral presences. We use them, as it were, to decorate our lives, but actually we know that they're much more important than that. Why would we otherwise cultivate gardens and attempt to live in the midst of the flourishing plants? Well, most people would say for no apparent reason. I just like the color. I just like the liveliness. Something more is going on here that I think humans are resonating with because of our own sensibility. The creative work does often occur at the edges. So blossoms and leaves, if you think about it, an incredibly intricate woven carpet of edge work. Edges are not just edges of hard objects, they're edges of living beings. It can be very soft, of course, but they're no less potent, no less creative in being such pliable and movable and changeable in their very nature. Well, there's a lot more to be said. Thank you I appreciate your picking up that theme from the book, because it's, as you must know, there's a whole chapter on it. I am a little obsessed with this theme, that the action occurs at the edge, as I like to put it. That's one of my axioms of recent writing. I'm trying to decenter our thinking along these lines, and particularly to decenter it from the view that human beings are somehow at the center of things. We are not, and the sooner we realize that, the better. And this has implications for nonviolence. It's a theme of the Kerulos Center, of course. Violence, if you think about it, is what we do to each other at our vulnerable edges. So how to respect those edges and how to appreciate them without violence becomes the challenge for human beings. Plants have already figured it out. They don't waste their time, massacring and killing each other. They can compete, but it's not quite the same as being violent and forcing your way at the expense of other plants. Instead, it's a matter of, what shall we call it, finding your way in an ever-evolving place that suits and accommodates diverse species living together. And the plant community is the perfect example of such an absolutely complex but fundamentally peaceful world. You can begin to see how place, the language of place, and the language of edge converge in giving us a couple of different handles on what we take for granted in our daily lives. And so this is what I consider the task of phenomenology, is to bring out that which has been obscured from vision by simple repetition, habituation, without really wondering, can it be different? Ought it not to be different? And when you move that way, you move to the edge of your own thinking. Think about it. Plants they are at the edges of many of our lives. We have a small garden that's at the edge. It's not completely accidental. I would say there's something absolutely correct about that. Or formal gardens, which are at the edges of, thinking of Versailles, which I discuss in the book, the garden at Versailles, which is actually at the very edge of the palace of Louis XIV. Not accidental, that's exactly where it is placed, and that's where the plants flourish. Out and around the palace, which can take care of itself, otherwise is a center of power. But the garden at Versailles has persisted, and in many respects is indeed still the major attraction of those who visit Versailles, including myself many times. That's not really accidental. It's quite powerfully suggestive of what plants can do when they surround and circle, situate themselves at the periphery. I'm quite obsessed these days with any word that starts with peri, perilous, peri, periphery. It all means, of course, goes back to peri, Greek for around, or at the edge. There's a whole set of words that have trickled down into English and other European languages that are certainly reflecting the power of edge that here shows up even in linguistic expressions that we use all unthinkingly, but nevertheless, I think, powerfully.
Beautiful. Thank you, Ed. And thank you, Izzy, for your question. That's fascinating. Yeah. We have another question. I think this is from Gay, the Kerulos Center. Has your journey into plant place affected your sense of identity of place and sense of self-identity?
Well, that's would take a whole psychoanalysis to spell out, but it's an interesting question. Let's just say that in my earlier career and earlier life, plants played very small role for me philosophically. Personally, I found myself drawn to certain trees, particularly trees, in my case, in my hometown of Topeka, Kansas. When I first started painting at a very young age, it was always of trees, and it included the roots of trees in those early paintings. I didn't know why I was doing it. It was kind of mysterious to me that this could be so powerful and attractive to represent in art. And so I let it be, as it were, on the side, at the periphery of my life. And it really took many decades for me to move to plants. Like many phenomenologists, my primary efforts were in understanding human mentation, using a word that would include memory and some things about which I did write when I was much younger. None of them had any relation to the natural world. They were all self-enclosed. And so it's very striking that somewhere, somehow, in the last, I'd say 8 to 10 years, I began to realize, well, here is a completely omitted chapter of my work. And so I began to stretch out, reach out, So I think that must have personal consequences, interpersonal consequences. I'm sure it does. It would be too much to spell out today, except that I am very happy to be situated in Santa Barbara in a place that is a garden. This is due thanks to my partner, Mary Watkins, who created this and planted this. And suddenly I realized this is what I was looking for, but I didn't even know that I was until I got here. I really appreciate the way that it's a subtle form of, I'd like to use the term transfluence, not just influence. It's influence across a different species and across different spaces and places, which is, I think, the great gift of plant life itself. And so it lacks the drama of Promethean struggles among humans or even between humans and animals. It's much more subtle. But I would like to think that philosophers need to take account of these peripheral circumstances far more than they have. I'm not alone in this. This is becoming very, very, very intensely pursued by philosophers of this era. And Michael Marder is a leading figure in this. And I take a lot of inspiration from his work, even though he's much younger than I. He's actually was my student at one point, but frankly, I'm now his student. And so we activate each other in this respect. So Jay, the Gay's question would require another 45-minute pondering. I'm afraid I won't be able to do justice to it.
It's beautiful, Gay. Beautiful question, Gay, and thank you, Ed, for a little bit of exploration into it. We have another comment here from someone at the Kerulos Center. During your discussion, I felt a deep shift from seeing to being seen as I looked through the window where the forest is. So beautiful, beautiful work. If there's any other questions right now from our audience, please feel free to type them into the chat and we can go through them before we end, but we'll leave a couple minutes for that. Otherwise, I think we'll wrap up unless, Ed, you have any final comments or anything you'd like to share?
There's just instability in the internet, but speaking of seeing trees through windows, and one part of our book takes up this recent research, which shows that if you're in a hospital room and you could given even a glimpse of vegetal life, trees, plants, whatever, that you can see from your window, the recovery rate is strikingly improved on people who have that view, and those who don't, who are in virtual solitary confinement, the theme I started with today, are much less likely to improve, even though these we're talking about physical states, physical, mental, medical states. So there's a very powerful notion of how the vegetal world can come in at the periphery through the window of the hospital and have curative power. This surely requires a lot more analysis and thought as to how this could be the case. But it is the case. There have been a number of studies, we cite them in our book, as to the fact that this is the case. This is quite remarkable.
That's incredible. Wow, so interesting. That's really amazing. That's great.
Yeah.
Ed, thank you so much for taking your time to be here with us today. This has been just enlightening and inspiring, and it's so great to spend this time together.
Thank you, Olivia, and thank you for inviting me, and Gay, and thanks to everyone else for hanging in there through this talk. My pleasure.
It's been excellent. Thank you so much, Ed. Our next speaker in this series will be a week from today on Friday, May 3rd at 10 a.m. Pacific time. We will be joined by one of our guests here today, Isabella Clark, an independent researcher who has written and presented on non-human animal cultures and relationships with the more than human. If you enjoy Living One and feel called to support Kerulos, Living One, and all our sanctuary residents, please consider donating at the link on our website, kerulos.org. Once again, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Ed, for sharing your time with us. From all of us here at Kerulos, we really appreciate you being here. Have a great day, everybody. See you next time.